Good afternoon. It's Monday, January 26th. I'm Ariel O'Sullivan, and this is IBA News broadcasting from Jerusalem. The ongoing political corruption investigation is widening, with reports of a minister, a cabinet secretary, and an influential Knesset committee chairman now being questioned by police. There's also a Kulanu candidate who's been disqualified, and the Prime Minister defends his wife. Here with more is IBA's political correspondent, Eli Wogelinter.
We'll start with the ongoing police probe into political kickbacks that started with Yisrael Beitenu, but is now widening to other parties. A former cabinet secretary and a leading public relations consultant were detained by police for questioning this morning in the ongoing investigation of alleged corruption connected to the Yisrael Beitenu party, but clearly not limited to that party. 2 women in the employ of the civil service were also detained on suspicion of channeling government funds to various causes in exchange for profit. Police raided the homes and offices of the 4 suspects and confiscated computers and documents. Authorities are reviewing the evidence against the 4 and will decide later today whether to place them under arrest. In addition, police sources say that at least 3 Knesset members, one of them a minister, will also be questioned in the coming days. Officials say the former cabinet secretary, now the owner of a strategic consulting firm, was suspected of accepting a bribe from government officials in order to employ a specific PR agency in a project sponsored by the government. The PR consultant was suspected of bribing civil servants in order to win bids for government projects. Turning now to party political news, and Moshe Kachlon's Kulanu party received a black eye today when the Central Election Committee disqualified the party's number 2, Tsaga Malaku, from running in the election. The reason? Central Elections Committee Chairman Judge Salim Jubran ruled that journalist Malaku did not leave her position at the Israel Broadcast Authority a sufficient amount of time prior to the March 17th election. Kulanu had argued that Malaku's position at the IBA was not senior enough to be governed by the law, which states that senior state employees must resign from their position 100 days before taking part in an election. Over to the Zionist Camp Party, previously known as Labor and Hatzanuah. Last night, the merged parties finalized the composition of its list for the Knesset election. Professor Manuel Trachtenberg, who was 11th on the list and earmarked for a senior financial role in the next government, was booed by a large part of the crowd. Also on the list is Yael Cohen-Paran, co-chairman of the Green Movement, who was nominated to a slot by party co-leader Tzipi Livni, former Kadima MK and Hatzanuah member Yoel Hasson, and former Labour Party chairman Amir Peretz, who was lauded throughout the night and received a royal welcome from a chanting crowd. Party leader Isaac Herzog addressed the crowd, saying, "No one will teach us what Zionism is. We are the true Zionism." While Hatzanuah leader Livni addressed Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, saying, "You know the elections have been decided, and you are on your way home." Netanyahu has something to say today himself, and not about the brouhaha over his speech in March before Congress. Responding to leaked testimony given by 2 former employees of the Prime Minister's residence, which claimed that Sarah Netanyahu verbally abused the workers and had issues with alcohol consumption, Netanyahu brushed off the allegations as a media attack on his family before the upcoming elections. He said it was another low in the relationship between myself and leading figures in the Israeli media who will stop at nothing to hurt me and my political path. I will say it as clearly as possible, he said. Anyone who wants to attack my policies is welcome to do so directly. Leave my family out of it. The Prime Minister certainly has a lot on his plate this week. Aryeh?
Thank you, Eli, for that report. A senior police officer was questioned today by the Justice Ministry's Police Investigation Unit on allegations of sexual harassment and exploiting his position of seniority. It was the second time the same was called in for questioning by the unit. Last night, he was released to house arrest for 5 days. The suspect is the 6th police officer accused of abusing his authority and was reportedly considered a leading candidate to be nominated as the next police commissioner. Taking advantage of his position, the police officer allegedly sexually harassed and committed indecent acts on a low-ranking policewoman who sought his help. He also reportedly harassed at least 5 other policewomen. He is also suspected of obstruction of justice and destroying evidence for allegedly attempting to destroy evidence after being informed that he was wanted for questioning. The last scandal came hours after Police Commander Kobe Cohen, head of the Judea and Samaria region, announced he was leaving the police force after being accused of having had forbidden relations with the policewoman under his command. Shula Zaken is once again free. A parole board released the longtime bureau chief of former Prime Minister Ehud Olmert from Neve Tirza prison after she served just 6 months of an 11-month sentence for bribe-taking. Zaken turned state witness against Olmert in the Holy Land corruption scandal. Olmert was sentenced to 6 years in prison, but his sentence has been delayed pending an appeal. A sacred duty. That's how Israel's ambassador to the United States, Ron Dermer, described Prime Minister Netanyahu's planned speech before Congress on March 3rd. Addressing an Israel Bonds fundraiser in Florida, Dermer deflected criticism of the timing of the speech so close to Israeli elections, saying that the Prime Minister has the duty to travel anywhere and at any time to protect Israel from the existential threat of a nuclear Iran.
Israel must not be silent. Israel must speak the truth, and we must speak it fearlessly and unapologetically. That is why it was so important for the Prime Minister of Israel to be in France. That is why it was so important for him to march in Paris and to speak out. And if it was important for the Prime Minister to speak out in Paris against anti-Semitism and the threat from militant Islam, it is even more important for him to speak out in Washington, D.C. about the dangers of a nuclear Iran. The Prime Minister's visit here is not intended to show any disrespect for President Obama. Israel deeply appreciates the strong support we have received from President Obama in many areas: an enhanced security cooperation, heightened intelligence sharing, generous military assistance and Iron Dome funding, and opposition to anti-Israel initiatives at the United Nations. And I have no doubt that the Prime Minister will speak very forcefully about that strong support from President Obama when he appears before the Congress. Today, the international community stands at the precipice of forging an agreement with Iran over its nuclear program. The agreement that is being discussed today is not an agreement that would dismantle Iran's nuclear weapons capability, but rather one that could leave Iran as a nuclear threshold state. That is an agreement that could endanger the very existence of Israel. Now, there may be some people who believe that the Prime Minister of Israel should have declined an invitation to speak before the most powerful parliament in the world on an issue that concerns the future and survival of Israel. But we have learned from our history that the world becomes a more dangerous place for the Jewish people when the Jewish people are silent. That is why the Prime Minister feels the deepest moral obligation to appear before the Congress to speak about an existential issue facing the one and only Jewish state. That is not just the right of the Prime Minister of Israel. It is his most sacred duty to do whatever he can to prevent Iran from ever developing nuclear weapons that can be aimed at Israel.
White House advisor Dennis McDonough refused comments on whether President Obama was angered over Netanyahu's invitation by Congress and Dermer's apparent oversight in not telling Secretary of State Kerry about the invitation.
Our view is that, as a traditional matter, we have avoided getting in the middle of our friends, even our closest friends, like Great Britain or Israel, getting in the middle of their campaigns. Given the proximity of this visit to that election in Israel, we just think it doesn't make any sense for us to have a meeting, so that's how we're going to treat it. But also, let's take a step back and talk a little bit about the strength of this bilateral relationship and its breadth, from our shared values to intelligence to military,
I understand that,
and that's exactly how we're going to treat this.
But are you angry, honestly? Is the President, is the White House, are you angry with Speaker Boehner for doing this on his own and for Netanyahu accepting it on his own without any consultation with the White House?
Look, I don't spend a lot of time on my emotions or getting angry or otherwise. I spend a lot of time dealing with the situations that we're presented with. And here's the way the President has always seen the U.S.-Israel relationship: as above partisan politics, something that is fundamentally in our interests. And so that's how we'll continue to treat this, irrespective of how this thing goes back and forth.
But the fact is that the Secretary of State, John Kerry, met with the Israeli ambassador to the U.S., Mr. Dermer, for 2 hours on Tuesday. Dermer never mentioned that to him. Doesn't that raise issues about the strength of the relationship?
The strength of this relationship is based on our shared values, the shared threats we confront, and the shared opportunities we create. We'll continue to do that. We'll continue to support our ally. I'll let Secretary Kerry or maybe even Ambassador Dermer explain why that occurred the way it did. The President's view is this relationship is in the national interest. It should be treated as nonpartisan. That's the way it's always been treated, and that's exactly how we'll do it.
President Rivlin is in New York ahead of his appearance tomorrow at a special session of the United Nations marking the International Holocaust Remembrance Day. Rivlin's first day of a 5-day visit to the United States began in Brooklyn, New York, where he addressed hundreds gathered at the Christian Cultural Center. Rivlin told the audience, Jerusalem will serve as an example of coexistence between different religions and communities. He also met leaders and members of the African American community and borrowed a line from Martin Luther King.
Today, the world faces the challenges of fighting terror. We must remember, Islam is not an enemy. We are not at war with Islam. Our enemy is hatred. Our enemy is hatred, which is fed today by fundamentalists. The victims of this hatred are religious minority, Christians, Jews, Yazidis, Kurds, but first and foremost, hundreds of thousands of Muslims that are being slaughtered today by Muslims. I have a dream that once again God will knock on our door. I dream that Jerusalem, as a microcosm of the world, will serve as model of coexistence between different communities and religions.
The Argentinian journalist who broke the news of the death of prosecutor Alberto Nisman has arrived in Israel after fleeing his homeland. A dual Israeli-Argentinian citizen, Damien Pachter, told reporters that he feared for his life. Nisman was investigating the deadly 1994 bombing of the Jewish Community Center in Buenos Aires that killed 83 people, and alleged that President Cristina Fernandez conspired to derail his investigation of the attack.
Because I was, the Argentine government pursued me because of my news reports regarding the death of prosecutor Alberto Nisman, who died in an unresolved way last week. So I was the first who reported on that, and now I'm kind of suffering the consequences of that. They used their security forces to chase me, and I just had to move fast and quick, as fast as I could, in order to get into a plane and just leave the country right away. I came to Israel because I'm an Israeli citizen. I live here the most important years of my life, and this is the place where I feel safe.
In Egypt, at least 18 people were killed, including 3 policemen, in bloody protests that erupted across the country as demonstrators took to the streets to mark the 4th anniversary of Hosni Mubarak's ouster. Meanwhile, Mubarak's sons, Alaa and Gamal, were released from prison today, where they've been incarcerated since 2011. IBA's Mark Lutkevich has this report.
Yesterday's clashes erupted despite a heavy security presence in cities across the country. In Cairo, roads were sealed off by security forces in an attempt to contain the unrest. The protests were staged to mark the 4th anniversary of the 2011 uprising that toppled Hosni Mubarak after 3 decades of power and marked the start of a revolution in the country and the beginning of the Arab Spring. Intense violence was reported in the Cairo district of Mataria, where supporters of ousted President and Muslim Brotherhood leader Mohamed Morsi and pro-government protesters clashed, with unrest continuing deep into the night. It was in this district that 10 people were killed. Sirens and gunfire were also held elsewhere in the capital. Egyptian health officials said 1 person was killed in Cairo and 4 more, including 2 policemen in the Giza district. Another in Alexandria, and 2 when a bomb they planted exploded prematurely in the Nile Delta. The Interior Ministry said hundreds of people were arrested by security forces. Ever since he was elected president in June last year, Egypt's president, former military ruler Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, has ruled the country with an iron fist, cracking down on all forms of political dissent. In 2011, 18 days of mass protest forced Mubarak to resign. He was subsequently convicted of complicity in the deaths of some 860 people killed during the uprising, but the conviction was overturned in an appeal. The Supreme Council of Armed Forces then assumed presidential power. Parliamentary elections the following year saw the Muslim Brotherhood's Freedom and Justice Party rise to power, and in June 2012, Mohamed Morsi was elected president. However, public opposition against Morsi began to mount, and he was deposed by the military in 2013. Tensions reached an all-time high between pro- and anti-Muslim Brotherhood supporters, and peaked when security forces killed nearly 1,000 people in 2 pro-Morsi sit-ins in Cairo. In December 2014, a new constitution was drafted and elections held. In June last year, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi was sworn in as president of Egypt. The past 4 years have played havoc with the country's economy. Tourism has hit an all-time low. It is unclear whether this latest unrest signifies the start of another round of bloody violence that will plunge the country into even more chaos. Margo Dudkevich, IBA News.
On to the elections in Greece, where the left-wing Syriza party is the victor, and questions abound regarding the nation's relationship with Europe. Alexander Jen has more on this.
Well, REA, the Syriza party can count on 149 of the 300 seats in parliament, just short of an absolute majority. But the victors have already reached a coalition deal with a small right-wing party, putting them on course to form a government by Wednesday. The Greeks have passed on the power to leftist Alexis Tsipras, who will attempt to lead his new government on a mission to bring an end to austerity measures. Syriza supporters went wild when they received the news that a new party had won the chance to turn things around for Greece. After years of devastating cuts to pensions and wages and an unemployment rate of 25%, the optimists are finally breathing a sigh of relief.
We're very happy tonight, first of all, and we really think that it's time for a change and that this Prime Minister will make it happen. We really think that.
The outgoing New Democracy Party won the second highest amount of votes, trailing Syriza by 9%, and Golden Dawn took the third highest share at 6.3%. Tsipras will be sworn into office on Monday and hopes to have a government in place as early as Wednesday morning. Fresh off his defeat, Antonis Samaras says, "The Greek people have spoken, and we all respect their decision. My conscience is clear." Samaras did not entirely rule out a unity government. After the results of the election came out, he met with Tsipras to attempt the formation of a coalition government, but Tsipras rejected the idea. Tsipras' victory has provoked mixed reactions in other European countries. Some believe his challenge to the IMF and EU will allow for other struggling countries to follow suit. Tsipras is only 40 years old now, but he has gained the support of his nation and now holds the future of the country in his hands. Earlier today, I spoke on the phone with the former Israeli ambassador to Greece, Aryeh Mekel. I asked him about the implications of the election for Greece-Israel relations, as well as Tsipras' challenge to the IMF and the EU over bailout reforms.
Tsipras is challenging it. He says, you know, we may need your help, but we don't need your reforms and your austerity. And you have to give it to us anyway, because we are part of you and that you don't want to lose us, etc., etc. So it's a challenge to Europe. I cannot see how the Europeans and the IMF will give in. I mean, they are already saying Greece has to live up to its commitments. However, in reality, at some point they will have to find a compromise. It may take a few months, I would say till the summer, but at some point they will have to compromise.
What are the implications of the election for Greece-Israel relations?
Over the last 4 years, the relations between Greece and Israel have really soared. They are now very good, unprecedented. But it's not a secret that this new party, Syriza, that we can describe as extreme left, they are very critical of this relationship. They are those who arranged various demonstrations against Israel in Athens. And one of their senior leaders, actually a man who may well be a minister of defense, personally took part, participated in one of those flotillas to Gaza. It's not that he supported it like others, he actually went physically. So I would say that it's not going to happen overnight, but the relationship may suffer, especially the defense relationship, which is more or less leading the way.
And we're expecting a new government in Greece by Wednesday.
Oh, thank you, Alexander. Ahead of the International Holocaust Memorial Day, an olive tree from the Galilee was planted today in a special ceremony in Nice, France, at a memorial for 128 righteous among the nations who aided Jews during the Holocaust. The olive tree was transported by El Al in a special wooden container in a project organized by the Jewish National Fund. Spokeswoman Osnat Eitan told IBA News, "We chose an olive tree that grew in the Galilee, an area where Jews, Muslims, and Christians live together. The tree represents peace seekers all over the world and symbolizes our answer to the extremists who threaten global peace." Taking a look at local finance, and the shekel today dropped in value against major foreign currencies while share prices on the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange were up. Here's a look at the afternoon numbers. Turning to the weather, and the forecast is for partly cloudy skies, and in the south of the country there's a slight chance of rain in the evening. Here's a look at the expected highs and lows at home and abroad for the next 24 hours. That's all for today. Please join us again tomorrow when Aaron Viner will be at this desk to bring you the latest news from Israel. Until then, I'm Aryeh O'Sullivan wishing you a pleasant evening and shalom from Jerusalem.